In 1898, one of the world's great empires was brought to a standstill. This didn't happen because of an army or a rebellion or a rival European power. This happened because of two lions. At the height of the British Empire, where maps of Africa were being reworked in London drawing rooms, and railway lines were carving through continents like signatures of ownership, something unexpected happened in a dry stretch of East African wilderness. Progress stopped. Steel stopped. The empire stopped. Because at a remote railway camp near the Tsavo River, men started to disappear. I want you to imagine this. You're hundreds of miles from the coast, surrounded by scrub and open plains. The heat is relentless. The air smells of dust and wood smoke. Canvas tents flap in the evening wind. Fires crackle around the perimeter to try to keep predators at bay. And you're exhausted from laying track under the punishing sun. You eat your dinner, you lie down, and you try to get some sleep. Sometime after midnight, you awaken to the sounds of screaming. Not shouting or calls of confusion, no, blood-curdling screaming. A tent opens and something massive moves through the camp. In the chaos, shadows leap from the firelight. A man is dragged away. By the time anyone gathers the courage to follow them into the darkness, there is nothing but silence. And a trail of blood and dirt leading to the bush. Now, this wasn't a one-off incident. It happened again and again and again. For 9 whole months in 1898, 2 male lions systematically targeted railway workers during construction of what would become the Uganda Railway in what we now know as Kenya. The British press would later sensationalize this story. Survivors would speak of supernatural huntings. The officer in charge, John Henry Patterson, would publish an account that would turn these lions into a global phenomenon. They would eventually become known as the Tsavo Man-Eating lions. But when you strip away the myth, you're left with something that is arguably even more upsetting and unsettling. 2 maneless lions that discovered that humans, even backed by rifles and an empire, well, they could be food. And once those lions learned that lesson, well, it was very difficult to unlearn it. This isn't just a story about animal attacks. This is a story about fear. It's about ecological unbalance and collapse. It's about the colonial ambition meeting the realities of the real world. Because for all the rhetoric of progress and control over nature, the Tsavo lions, well, they revealed something. That out there, beyond the reach of control and certainty, we are not the top of the food chain. So today, we're going to unpack what really happened in Tsavo. How many people actually died? Why did these lions turn to humans? And what does modern science say about this behavior? More than a century later, their bodies are still preserved in a museum in Chicago. Smaller than you might expect, but carrying one of the most chilling reputations in the animal kingdom. This is the story of the Tsavo Man-Eaters. To understand the Tsavo Man-Eaters, you have to zoom out, because this wasn't just like a wildlife incident. This was an imperial moment. In the late 1800s, European powers were in the middle of what historians now call the scramble for Africa. Territories were being claimed, borders were being drawn with rulers across maps, and influence was measured in railways, ports, and trade routes. For Britain, East Africa was strategic. Control the coast, control the interior, control the trade, control the people. The Uganda Railway, sometimes mockingly called the Lunatic Express, was designed to run from the port city of Mombasa towards Lake Victoria. From there, goods, troops, and administrators could move more effectively through the British-controlled African territory. On paper, it was a feat of engineering, but in reality, it was a logistical nightmare. The railway would cut through what is now Kenya, across swamps thick with malaria, escarpments requiring dangerous blasting, and vast stretches of wilderness that had barely been mapped by Europeans. The British imported more than 30,000 people from India. Many were skilled railway workers, but even more were unprepared for this vast wilderness. And then there was Tsavo. Tsavo was not a bustling establishment by any means. It wasn't even really a proper town at this point. It really was just wilderness. Dry, red earth, thick, thorny acacia scrub, seasonal riverbeds, and wildlife. Wildlife absolutely everywhere. Elephants moved in herds, buffalo grazed on dense bush, crocodiles lurked in the river, and lions roamed the open plains. Now, the railway required a bridge across the Tsavo River, and that bridge would become the epicenter of these attacks. The man placed in charge of constructing it was Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson, an Anglo-Irish engineer and military officer. Patterson wasn't just overseeing paperwork, he was on site. He was living in the same harsh conditions as his men, and he was responsible not only for construction timelines, but for morale and safety. When he arrived in Tsavo in early 1898, he encountered a landscape that felt ancient and was indifferent to human ambition. There were no permanent settlements nearby, no urban infrastructure, no quick reinforcements, just campfires against the darkness. The railway camp itself was temporary. Rows of canvas tents, storage depots, stacks of timber, rails waiting to be laid, and thorn barricades constructed nightly to keep predators out. These thorny walls, called bombas, were made from dense acacia branches, with long, thick, vicious spikes. Traditionally, they were used to deter lions from livestock. But the lions of Tsavo weren't naive to human settlements. They had lived alongside pastoral communities for generations. They understood livestock enclosures. They understood they meant opportunity. And as the railway camp grew with thousands of workers, food supplies, noise, and human scent, it disrupted the surrounding ecosystem. Wild animals shifted their movement patterns. Prey animals avoided the noise, and predators adjusted. What's important here is this. This railway was not being built on empty land. It was being forced through an active living ecosystem, an ecosystem that was already under stress. The 1890s in East Africa had been devastating. A rinderpest epidemic had swept through the region, wiping out massive populations of cattle and wild ungulates, the very animals lions typically rely on for food. Drought compounded the problem. Prey was scarcer than usual, and now thousands of humans had arrived. Humans who slept on the ground, lived in canvas tents, left food scraps everywhere, and created predictable nightly routines. From a predator's perspective, this railway camp wasn't just an intrusion, it was an opportunity for food. And that's what makes Tsavo so significant. It wasn't simply that lions attacked people, it was a collision between imperial power and ecological pressure. And it created the perfect conditions for something truly unprecedented. And in this harsh stretch of East Africa, those forces were about to collide in a way that no one on that railway project could have imagined. At first, it didn't feel like a pattern, it just seemed like bad luck. A labourer failed to report for work one morning. His tent was empty, his tools were left untouched. Among the thousands of workers now working on the railway in Kenya, desertion wasn't unusual. The heat was punishing, disease was rampant, and the work was relentless. Some men just simply walked away from it. So when the first man just sort of disappeared, well, no one really paid too much attention to that. But then, another man vanished. And this time, the canvas of one of their tents had been ripped open. Not cleanly cut, but ripped open. There were drag marks in the dirt, a faint, dark stain leading outside into the bush. And the truth began to settle in slowly. Something was entering the camp and taking these people. To understand the psychological impact of something like this, you really have to picture the camp after dark. There were no electric lights like in the modern world, no flood lamps, no radios. Once the sun dropped below the horizon, the African bush transformed. The temperature cooled slightly, but the darkness deepened in a way that almost feels physical. Firelight only illuminated a small circle. Beyond that, it was blackness. And in that darkness were eyes. Now, lions are primarily nocturnal hunters. Their vision is adapted for low light. Their hearing is exceptional. Their approach is silent. The workers began hearing things at night. Heavy breathing, footsteps in the bushes, a low, rumbling growl. Sometimes the lions would circle the camp for hours, testing it, waiting for the fires to burn low, waiting for exhaustion to overtake vigilance. And then they would strike. Witness accounts describe chaos, men shouting, scrambling for weapons, grabbing lanterns. By the time anyone reached the source of the noise, the lion and his victim were gone. These attacks were surgical. They were quick, they were precise. And worst of all, they were unpredictable. The railway workers constructed bombers each night. Thick walls of thorn branches arranged in defensive rings around sleeping quarters. Traditionally, these were effective against predators, but the lions were not deterred. They pushed through, they leapt over them. They even, according to some accounts, crawled underneath them. The men reinforced the barriers, they stacked them higher, they lit more fires. None of it worked, because the lions adapted, and adaptation is the key. Most lions that encounter a human settlement are cautious. They may test the edges, they might scavenge, but repeated direct entry into an active camp with noise, fire, and human presence, well, that's really rare. These lions were bold, or they were really desperate, or maybe they were both. As the weeks passed, the disappearances became harder to ignore. Remains were found in bushes, partially eaten bodies were located, clothing scraps, bone, blood. Now there was no pretending what was happening. These weren't desertions, they weren't murders from other people in the camp. These were hunts, and the hunts were increasing in frequency and in violence. Some nights passed without incident, which may have been even worse, because it meant the waiting stretched on. Every sunset carried dread. Men began to refuse to sleep alone. Some moved their bedding closer together towards the center of the camp. Others stayed awake in shifts with rifles at the ready. But exhaustion is a predator's ally and a prey's weakness. The lions seemed to understand human sleeping patterns. They often attacked in the deepest part of the night, when even the most alert guard would struggle to stay awake. And as the fear spread, so did the stories. Whispers spread throughout the camp that these weren't just normal lions. They were spirits. They were demons. They were cursed creatures sent to punish them for their transgressions. Some of the workers believed that these lions could not be killed. Others insisted that they moved silently and appeared where they physically shouldn't be able to. And as we know, when fear escalates beyond explanation, well, that's when the supernatural fills the gap. Remember, many of these men were far from home. They were isolated. They were under extreme stress. They were surrounded by unfamiliar landscapes and unfamiliar wildlife. Every rustle in the brush became amplified. Every distant roar carried a personal meaning. The lions weren't just killing, they were dismantling the camp's morale. For John Henry Patterson, the situation shifted from troubling to catastrophic, because to him this wasn't really a wildlife issue. This was a threat to the entire railway project. Workers were beginning to flee. Supplies were being abandoned. Timelines were slipping. If the labour force collapsed entirely, then the bridge over the Tsavo River would never be completed, and with it a critical link to Britain's imperial ambitions. Patterson initially believed a single solitary animal was responsible for the attacks, but the paw prints and tracks, well, they told a different story. The men found two different sets of prints, two large males, working in the same territory and often, seemingly, working together. That detail would haunt the investigation. Because cooperative hunting behavior, like wolves or humans do, well, that's extremely unusual for male lions. Up until this point, the railway represented technological dominance. Steel rails, rifles, imported labor, imperial confidence. The vanishings shattered that illusion. For the first time, the workers weren't thinking about progress. They were just thinking about how to survive. And in Tsavo, survival was no longer guaranteed by the Empire. It was dictated by whatever was moving out there in the dark. The disappearances were no longer isolated incidents, they were a pattern, and that pattern was accelerating. The lions had learned that the camp was a reliable hunting ground, and once a predator learns that lesson, it never really unlearns it. By this point, the railway workers knew something important, that this wasn't a single lion. Tracks in the dust had revealed two sets of prints. Two large males moving through the same territory, often approaching from different angles, often coordinating attacks together. Male lions do sometimes form coalitions, often brothers who stay together after leaving their birth pride. These coalitions typically cooperate to defend territory or take over a pride of females, but sustained coordinated predation on humans? That's rare. Extremely rare. One of the first things that unsettled the observers was their appearance. These lions had no manes. Today, we know that lions in the Tsavo region often have reduced manes due to genetics and climate. Thicker manes could be a disadvantage in extreme heat. Sparse maned males aren't uncommon there. But in 1898, this did look strange. It almost looked supernatural. The classic image of a male lion, large, golden, crowned and thick hair, didn't apply here. These animals appeared sleeker, leaner, more shadow than silhouette. And in the flicker of the firelight, that lack of mane likely made them appear even more ghost-like. It's easy to see how stories of the ghost and the darkness began to spread. Most lions actively avoid human camps unless extremely pressured. These two did the opposite. They entered regularly. They showed little fear. They appeared to study defensive patterns. Witness accounts suggest that they would circle the perimeter for extended periods. They would test the weak points of the bombers. They would retreat if guards were alerted and return later. That level of persistence suggests learning. Predators are always calculating risk versus reward. If an attempt fails and ends in injury, Well, most would abandon that strategy. But these lions were succeeding, and success reinforces behavior. One detail continues to puzzle researchers. The lions didn't always fully consume their victims. In some cases, only partial remains were eaten. And this has led to some debate. Were they killing out of hunger? Or had they learned to treat humans as opportunistic prey, to attack and kill them even when they weren't hungry? Modern isotopic analysis of the lions' preserved remains at the Field Museum of Natural History suggests that while they have consumed a significant number of humans, their diet likely still included other animals as well. They weren't exclusively dependent on people, which makes their behavior even more chilling. Because unlike a lot of man-eaters, this wasn't purely out of desperation. For these lions, it was a choice. One of the two lions had significant dental damage, a broken canine, and abscessed root. That injury would have made grappling with large, struggling prey like buffalo or zebra painful. By comparison, us humans, well, we're a lot smaller. We sleep unprotected. We don't have hooves or horns. And generally, we don't run around in coordinated herds. From an evolutionary standpoint, humans in that camp represented low-risk calories. Once the lions discovered how easy it was to breach tents and drag victims into the darkness, the cost-benefit calculation likely shifted permanently. Perhaps one of the most unsettling parts of the Tsavo lions isn't their aggressiveness, it's their intelligence. Because these lions, well, they adjusted their attack times. They exploited weak defenses. They avoided heavily guarded areas. And they returned repeatedly, despite attempts to deter them. It's important to remember that predators like this aren't supervillains, okay? They're problem solvers. And in Tsavo, the problem that they solved was this. How do you hunt the dominant species in the region that are armed with rifles and knives? The answer, as it turned out, was patience and darkness. Now, what we're talking about now isn't necessarily biology, it's psychology. Because the real power of the Tsavo lions, well, it wasn't physical, it was psychological. The railway camp represented technological progress, rifles, engineering, organization, and imperial confidence. When the attacks began, there was an assumption that it would be quickly handled. Shoot the lion, problem solved, move on. But the attacks continued, week after week. And with every successful hunt from the lions, the illusion of control ended. Many began to dread the sunset. Work slowed during the day because exhaustion set in, and many were too afraid to sleep properly at night. Chronic sleep deprivation magnifies fear, it distorts perception, and it weakens morale. The lions were not just hunting bodies, they were dismantling stability. Now the workers and the men at the camp, they tried everything. They reinforced their bombers with thicker vines, they increased the number of fires, they set traps, they posted armed guards. Some workers moved their beds into the center of the camp. Others climbed trees at night, trying to avoid ground-level attacks. There are accounts of men tying themselves to one another before sleeping, hoping the additional weight and resistance would prevent a lion from dragging them silently away. Just try to imagine the desperation behind that decision-making. To sleep bound to another human being, oftentimes a stranger, out of fear of being carried away like prey. As fatalities mounted, something critical happened. Workers fled. Hundreds reportedly abandoned the project. Some returned towards the coast, others disappeared into surrounding territory. For a railway project dependent on mass labour, this was absolutely catastrophic. The bridge to the Tsavo River remained unfinished. Supplies piled up, schedules collapsed. The Uganda Railway, a flagship of Imperial enterprise, was stalled by two large cats. And that fact alone magnified the legend. It wasn't just that people were dying, it was that the empire was faltering. John Henry Patterson claimed that the lions killed 135 men. That number became embedded in popular culture. However, modern analysis suggests a lower confirmation consumption figure, likely around 28 to 31 individuals, based on isotopic evidence from the lion's remains. But here's the crucial point. The exact number matters less than the duration and the impact. Even at the lower estimate, the attacks stretched across 9 months. And that's not a sudden impact, that's a campaign. And the psychological damage of sustained, unpredictable predation is enormous. When people tell this story, they often focus on the gore. But the more fascinating aspect to talk about here is the fear. If 30 people die in a single incident, it's tragic. But if 30 people die unpredictably across months, at night, one by one, from inside what is supposed to be a safe shelter, well, that changes people's behavior. It reshapes hierarchy. It disrupts economic patterns. It alters history. Tsavo became a place where no one trusted the dark. No barrier felt secure. No sleep felt safe. And the lions, whether consciously or not, well, they had discovered the most powerful weapon to use against human beings: uncertainty. By the time Patterson fully committed to hunting them, this wasn't just about stopping animal attacks. It was about restoring order. It was about restoring morale. Restoring the ideas that humans, we were in control. Because until the lions were dead, Tsavo belonged to them, and everybody in the camp knew that. Whenever a predator turns to human predation repeatedly, the same question always follows. Why? Were the Tsavo Man-Eaters aberrations? Were they monsters? Were they supernatural demons? Or were they simply responding to environmental pressure? Now, the answer is almost certainly layered. Number 1, injury and physical limitations. When researchers examined the preserved skull of the lions, now housed at the Field Museum of Natural History, they discovered something significant. One lion had a broken canine, had severe wear on other teeth, and an abscess that would have caused chronic pain. For a lion, as with any other predator, teeth are survival. A healthy lion kills by clamping onto the throat or muzzle of prey, suffocating it while it wrestles a struggling animal that can weigh several hundred kilograms. That requires grip strength, precision, and tolerance for impact. Now imagine trying to do that with an infected jaw. Suddenly that prey can now kick, gore, or trample you to death. Humans, by comparison, do not have horns, do not weigh 400 kilograms, and do not travel in tight-knit herds. From a purely evolutionary perspective, humans represented a low-risk prey. An injured predator doesn't moralize, it optimizes. The other thing we can talk about here is ecological collapse. The 1890s were disastrous across East Africa. Rinderpest, a viral disease affecting cattle and wild ungulates, swept through the region, decimated herds of buffalo, wildebeest, and other key prey species. And drought, well, that added to the equation. Prey populations dropped sharp, and when prey declines, predators are forced to adapt or starve. At the same time, this railway project brought thousands of humans into Africa, along with food supplies, waste, and livestock. That sudden concentration of humans in an ecosystem already under strain created an artificial prey cluster. To a predator experiencing food scarcity, this isn't really random, it's an opportunity. Now, another more creepy theory involves exposure to human remains. The Tsavo region was historically used by trade caravans. It's possible that unburied human remains from earlier conflicts or disease outbreaks were scavenged by lions. Scavenging lowers the behavioral barrier between human scent and food. Once that barrier is crossed, the psychological shift from scavenger to active hunter, well, that's not too large. Predators don't really have taboos like humans do. They just have memories. If something smells like food, behaves like food, it can be food. Perhaps the most important factor here, though, is success. The first time a lion drags a human from its tent and kills it without injuries to itself, it learns something crucial. The second time they do it, it reinforces that behavior. These lions weren't random attackers. They returned to the camp relentlessly. They navigated human defenses, and they operated for months. This suggests a behavioral pattern that had been rewarded enough times that it became entrenched in their minds. In other words, Tsavo wasn't a single mistake, it was a sustained adaptation. By mid-1898, John Henry Patterson understood that this was no longer a situation that was on the periphery. This was existential for the railway and for his authority. If he could not stop the lions, well, he risked losing control of the labor force that he needed. Patterson attempted multiple strategies. He constructed elevated platforms known as machans near areas where the lions had killed. He tethered bait animals. He used himself as live bait on several occasions, sitting in trees with a rifle in hand. Imagine the psychological weight of that. Sitting alone in a tree in the darkness, waiting for a lion to come and eat you. The lions didn't make his job easy either. They always approached cautiously. Sometimes they appeared and then vanished in an instant without giving the opportunity for a clean shot. On more than one occasion, Patterson reportedly missed opportunities due to poor light or obstructed angles. And each failure prolonged the terror. Finally, after months of attacks, Patterson finally shot one of the lions in December of 1898. But this wasn't a clean cinematic moment like the movie. The lion reportedly absorbed multiple rifle shots and still attempted to charge before collapsing. That detail really matters here, because these were not fragile animals. These were large, muscular males, powerful enough to drag adult men from their tents and kill them. Even wounded, they would remain dangerous. And when the first lion fell, morale lifted slightly. But the attacks didn't stop automatically. Remember, there's still another lion out there. Now, this remaining lion proved even more elusive. Weeks passed. Patterson continued setting ambushes. Finally, in late December, after another tense encounter, he shot the second lion. Again, it reportedly took multiple shots and several attempts before it succumbed to its injuries. When that body was finally laying still on the ground, something instantly shifted in the camp. The workers returned, the construction resumed, and the psychological spell of the Tsavo Man-Eaters was broken. The railway bridge over the Tsavo River was soon completed after that. It's important to remember Patterson's role in this story is inseparable from the legend. He framed the lions as near supernatural adversaries. And while some embellishment is likely, as with many colonial-era adventure accounts, there's no question that he actually risked his life repeatedly to end these attacks and to save the lives of his men. In Tsavo, this was like the most extreme form of pest control. It was a duel. It was empire versus predator. In 1907, nearly a decade after the events, Patterson published The Man-Eaters of Tsavo. It was dramatic. It was written in the tone of an Imperial adventure. It portrayed the lions as cunning, almost malevolent forces that defied conventional hunting logic. And it was a huge success. The Tsavo lions entered a global imagination. Patterson claimed that 135 victims were killed. Modern scientific analysis does challenge that number. Researchers examining isotopic signatures in the lion's bones estimated that about 28 to 31 individuals were consumed. However, this doesn't mean that more people weren't killed and simply not eaten. It is possible. Colonial record keeping wasn't perfect. So the true number of victims may never really be known. But what endures in this story isn't statistics or death toll numbers. Years later, Patterson sold the lion's skins and skulls to the Field Museum of Natural History. Taxidermists reconstructed them for display. Visitors today often remark on their size. They appear smaller than expected, less imposing than the myth would suggest. And yet, standing in front of them, knowing what they represent, the weight of their story remains. In 1996, the story was adapted into a Hollywood film, The Ghost and the Darkness, starring Val Kilmer and Ant-Man. The movie dramatized the story heavily. It added characters, it amplified the supernatural tone, and it framed the lions as almost mythical creatures and adversaries. But the core truth, it survived. 2 lions disrupted colonial expansion. 2 lions reshaped a massive infrastructure project. 2 lions proved that technological progress does not erase ecological reality. The Tsavo Man-Eaters endure in popular culture for several reasons. These include the duration of the attacks, the scale of the disruption, colonial backdrop, the eerie cooperation between the 2 lions, and the unresolved questions about motive. But perhaps, most of all, the story endures because it unsettles something fundamental within us. We like to believe that once we build enough railways, cities, or empires, we move beyond vulnerability. Tsavo says otherwise. In 1898, in a stretch of thorn and dust, nature reminded an empire that it was still part of the food chain. And that reminder echoes more than a century later.